around the room and give our credentials, and you can give us.
Great. Great, look forward to it.
So this afternoon, the last afternoon before our break, so we won't be here all afternoon, I hope. We've had a long week, and there is weather coming, but I guess it's not coming as quickly as we had worried about at one point. But so this afternoon, we're going to spend just a little more time hearing some testimony on H-126, which is the 30 by 30 bill that we discussed a little bit yesterday. We've got Alan Thompson with us right now at the table, who I'll let you introduce yourself, Alan, in a moment. We're also going to have Sam Lincoln joining us remotely. But let's just go around the room. We hadn't met before. I'm David Durfee, chairing the committee. I'm from Shaftesbury down in Bennington County, represent Glastonbury and Sunderland as well. And Vice Chair Supranat, go to you.
Sure. Hi, Heather Supranat. I represent Windsor 4, which is the towns of Barnard, Hofford, and Bridgewater.
Hi, I'm Esme Cole. I represent Hartford, which is Windsor 6 district.
Hi, John O'Brien, represent Royalton and my hometown of Concord.
Mike Rice, represent the Bennington Rutland district. It's Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
David Templeman, Brownington, Barton, Westmore.
Jed Lipsky, Lamoille 1, Stowe, and in full disclosure, I have known Al a long time and have had professional relationships with him in the industry of forestry.
Rodney Graham, represent Williamstown, Chelsea.
Yeah, so we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair, for the invitation being here, and very much appreciate the opportunity to do so. My name is Alan Thompson. I live in Waterbury, Vermont. I'm a licensed consulting forester, a certified wildlife biologist. I'm the president of Vermont Woodlands Association, chair of the Waterbury Land Initiative, a local land trust in Waterbury, an advisor to the Forest Future Strategic Roadmap, and a current use enrollee and a tree farmer. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of 126, a bill that I think is laudable and has lofty goals. I'm a strong advocate for forest management and land conservation in Vermont, and I'm hoping to take advantage of the opportunity that our forests give us and highlight the realities of our woodlands, our landowners, and their management to request a little bit more from this bill. As proposed, H-126 has two major sections. The bill asks for an inventory of conserved lands using three defined conservation areas: ecological reserves, biodiversity conservation areas, and natural resource management areas. The second section, the bill asks for a conservation plan to meet the stated goals of 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 and prioritize ecological reserve areas to protect highest priority natural communities and maintain and restore old forests. I am, as most are in the forest sector, aware of the global and environmental issues that press us into action and policy changes that seek protections of our unique ecosystems. Vermont Conservation Design is an ecological guide focused on connected functional ecosystems that I and many of my colleagues use often. I'm here to offer comments that I believe will serve the general principles of H-126, that we can invest in our forests with greater impacts, assist in building a stronger foundation for moving forward with land conservation, and ultimately accelerate biodiversity and climate strategies. The Forest Inventory Analysis Program has data that reports that Vermont forests continue their trend of having, on average, older, bigger trees that store more carbon, all goals of H-126 and land conservation. If nothing changed and our forests continue to mature and harvest rates and development patterns remain unchanged, stored forest carbon will increase by an estimated 28% by 2050. This too is from FIA data modeled in a recent HICID report, October 2022. By doing nothing, without new investments, without new policy, forests will store more carbon, be older, and reduce net emissions. At the same time, if nothing changed, without new investment or policy, forest management, working lands, and working land infrastructure will continue their same path. Reduction in withering. Similarly, the same HISED report, authors of which include Harvard Foresters, New England Forestry Foundation, Northeast Wilderness Trust, and others, posit that our forests can and should do better. This suggests that the single best solution to Vermont's climate goals is continuing to utilize and evolve our forest management. That using improved forest management in Vermont is modeled to store more than 4 times the carbon that having 10% of Vermont land in ecological reserve areas, more than 4 times. If the goal of H126 is to increase carbon storage and sequestration, H126 should at least equally prioritize strategies that have the most impact at the least costs. Working forests. Vermont Conservation Design's goals for a connected, diverse, and functional landscape also are greatly valued by forest professionals and landowners. Often, however, these goals of old growth forests are advocated for to the exclusion of the forest management that results in achieving VCD biodiversity targets, such as young forest. H126 has a unique opportunity to use Vermont Conservation Design goals in totality rather than prioritizing or emphasizing one over the other as it does currently. Much of Vermont's forest land is available for timber harvest. Relatively very little of it is considered ecological reserve areas. You will hear forestry industry professionals support conceptually the idea of reserve forests, and you will hear ardent anti-logging groups conceptually support forest management. Pose policy or harvest activities in a microcosm without working towards solutions of all parties, you find contradiction and conflict persisting. Ecological reserve areas are perceived as a take from the forest industry professionals in the same way a timber harvest feels like a take from old forest advocates. The fact that forests are available to be harvested does not mean that they will be. FIA data shows this. Forest managers and landowners have evolved in our ability to serve a breadth of goals, integrating old forest conditions, biological diversity, wildlife habitat, recreation, in the management of forests in pursuit of society's wood needs. But this balance only really works at appropriate spatial and temporal scales. You can't both cut and preserve a tree. We all need to be more intentional about where and when we do this, when we do the cutting and preserving. Working lands has an immense and overshadowing contributing value to climate and biodiversity goals, and they could do even more in perpetuity, given robust level of commitment that H126 could give it. H126 can build on that opportunity of being supportive, proactively engaging with all the parties from the outset, and recognize the myriad of values conserving land brings to our community without emphasizing or prioritizing preconceived and narrowly focused conservation categories, especially at this stage in proposing an inventory and conservation plan. Demand for our wood products is not a myth. It's forecasted to increase on every scale, and conserved land and public land can and should be used to provide those benefits. When I'm asked, where do I want my wood to come from, your wood to come from, our wood to come from, I'll say Vermont every time. But we can't do that if our culture or policy doesn't support it. So we have wood demand to meet, we have climate demands to meet, we have biodiversity demands to meet. Both require the ever-evolving forest management that private landowners and managers are and have been committed to. We need policymakers in our community committed to it too. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of 126.
Great, thank you. And are you able to stay for questions?
I am.
So open it up to any questions committee members might have. Representative Templeman.
So in, not in written words, but in your own voice, not to say that you didn't write that, what is the issue here with 126 that you'd like to see remedied? And how would you remedy that? From you know.
In generalities or specifically?
Oh, how about start with general and then specifically?
recognizing the value that working forests can play without reducing the ability for it to do so. This bill takes away the ability for working forests to contribute to climate goals and to biodiversity by emphasizing and prioritizing an inventory and conservation strategy toward reserve forests and old forests. We would rather see a conservation strategy and an inventory of all the conserved lands. Great. A conservation plans that says use conservation design to meet all of Vermont Conservation Design's targets. Let the inventory guide the process. Let Vermont Conservation Design continue to inform the process, and let VHCB dictate some of those conservation areas, those categories that are important. It's a very long list of how conservation land can contribute to the community's benefits. And if from the outset we think myopically about what conserved lands can do, the buy-in down the road that requires us in 15 years to get to 50 by 50, we need to start on a good solid foundation today.
So if I were to reiterate what you said in my own words, you would like this project to be informed from the bottom up rather than ideology down.
At least having, yes, I would like more input from the bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The boots on the ground.
We have a lot to offer.
Yeah. Thank you.
Representative O'Brien.
Did you follow this bill, was it last year we passed it? 30?
H606
Right. So, since you.
with less intention, but yes.
So is 126 like a step in the right direction? Like how do you feel about this iteration versus the one that got reviewed? Well, what made it better?
If I can speak solely on behalf of 126, I may do it with better confidence. I like the inventory is a really important step. It feels like it's leading the horse a little bit. And what really needs to happen is we need more information about what we have already and where we want to go. This bill emphasizes one target of Vermont Conservation Design. And it props up ecological reserve areas and biodiversity areas in a way that is a little disingenuous to our climate goals, where working forest can provide a much, much greater and easier solution. It's already doing that. And it can do more. And if we want to do that on conserved lands, we should really be being very intentional about not just allowing working lands to exist on conserved property, but promoting it, requiring it. We don't really have that mechanism right now in a lot of conserved land elements. It's allowed. That's about it. Ecological reserve areas say don't do it. There's nothing else to match and to offset the loss of ecological reserve areas to the working lands.
Those could never become like this permanently conserved working lands again.
That's fine. But, and that's true. And that's a valuable approach to achieving biodiversity goals. But it is a reduction in working land's ability to meet biodiversity goals, wood demands, and society needs.
Representative Templeman.
So we had the bill presented to us, I think it was yesterday morning. And it was made very clear to us that this plan would include working lands, that it would set aside perhaps 10%, 10% of the lands for permanent conservation, I guess, no management whatsoever. But that would leave the remaining 90 for, I would imagine, business as usual minus development. And that's problematic.
The scales are already in the favor of old forests.
As you were saying.
That trend is existing.
Mhm.
If nothing happens, that trend will continue to happen. And without investment, the trend will continue for working forests, and working forests' ability to contribute to climate goals will continue to be harder without investing and recognizing the value that it has in providing those goals now. So wood demand's increasing, working forests contribute an amazing amount to our world. Ecological reserve areas are great, but we need to prop up working lands in an equal way. Right now, we're just losing them. That's it.
Yeah, before I turn to Representative Lipsky, I will say that our committee has not spent, so we have not spent any time with the conservation design. So we've heard about it, but we're not familiar with it. And we may want to look at that a little bit more after we get back from our break. Can you just speak a little bit to, and this is not about conservation design, but about more broadly, we haven't spent a lot of time hearing from the folks in the forestry industry, the trend that you talked about, and I wrote down 28%. How, can you just talk a little bit about the mechanics and why that's the case, why we will have, by doing nothing, more old growth forests? Is it a function of what's out there that we know or believe is out there, and how much logging is currently taking place? And that's been modeled?
Since
Not right at all.
Since 1968, I believe, the USDA's Forest Inventory and Analysis Program has gone to over 1,000 plots in just Vermont and stood in that plot and counted trees, counted the size, measured trees, etc. Those plots are throughout the state. Over time, they can determine the condition of the forest and the trend of those forests. Since they have started counting, those forests have, on average, gotten older, and on average, trees in those forests have gotten bigger. So, and that includes development, that includes conversion to agriculture, that includes all the things we use our land for. And it's not my data, nor is it my modeling, but if those trends continue, trees get older. We'll just have more of that. It's the analysis of the existing trends modeled out into the future.
Okay, good, thank you. Representative Lipsky.
Alan, thank you for being here. You know, it was very important to me that as a forestry committee that we be engaged in this discussion on 126. You alluded in your presentation, and by the way, I've spent a lot of time trying to explain forest succession, some history of forest use in the last 200 years in Vermont, which leads us to this trend that Alan articulated by saying old forests are continuing to forests are continuing to age, and those working the forests as a factor in our culture and society is declining, for a whole nother discussion of reasons why. Not that they don't love the work, finding it to be sustainable or profitable or accessible. I want to speak to one thing that Alan alluded to, and I would want him to, in all his wisdom, say this is false or this is in fact a challenge. But those people who work in the forest, i.e. specifically loggers, in some case under rules and regulations mandate, but certainly under the leadership of the forestry profession, and by forestry, foresters are licensed. They all have, for the most part, degrees to achieve that license, to make silvicultural decisions, as well as be certain that the landowner's goals are being met. But most importantly, in the last 20 years, and each year seem to get more and more, those requirements are become higher, both higher costs and higher responsibility, and how and when and what time of year and under what conditions a logger or a timber harvester can actually work in the woods. And without question, every one of those new regulations and requirements are meant to improve the diversity of our forests, habitat for songbirds that we're seeing diminishing in our bird populations, other wildlife habitat, water quality, stream bank protection, sustainable and productive forest soils, which are a big factor in the whole carbon pool, and many other influences like recreation, which puts additional demands and big economic gains, by the way, for our state and our community. All these pressures are factors in why, as Alan makes a scale out of his arms, why forests are aging, but the working forest workers' opportunities are declining. So these are, and by the way, most forest harvesters are not necessarily being compensated for all these increasing responsibilities in their harvest practices, but they continue to do it and adapt and accept them for the most part, not all, but those that are surviving are doing it right. If you aren't doing it right, you aren't getting work. So that dynamic of the forest worker, which includes foresters, is there a risk from 126 is categories to sort of take more wind out of those sails?
There's a risk. There is. Land conservation brings a level of its own type of oversight and regulation. It's another cook in the kitchen. And so there is a risk there of increasing production costs. And I would hope that the plan could address the value of improved oversight and having some offset for those increased production costs. I will say that I work a lot with landowners and the general public, both of which very much appreciate the long list of regulations, oversight, supervision that we as managers can say, I'm licensed. We have loggers that are certified. We've got current use foresters. We've got harvests that go through permit review process. We have a long list of regulatory backstops to the work that we do. And as a forester, we, and I think even the community, depends on that as a way to protect the reputation of that. Being careful that we don't tip the balance away from what it means to actually produce wood in a productive way.
And another chapter, if you'll.
Quick one, I just because we need to move to the next witness too.
There is a subject called old growth, like imitation of old growth, or producing having a forest replicate old growth. Old growth used to be, when it existed, was a 400-year forest. Now old growth is considered optimally, 200 and above. And if the average age of because we're really in a fairly young cycle of forest, we might be between 80 and 110 year-old typical average forest. But I wanted to ask Alan about, and now I'm plugging in the notion of succession, forest succession. You abandon a farm field, you get goldenrod, blackberries, and eventually some white pine may seed in, or some white birch, which require a lot of sunlight to germinate. They're called a pioneer forest. Now they're mature, you've got 24-inch pines. I was asking our witness earlier about a job we did 4 years ago, left some really spectacular large spread of stunning gun barrel, large pine, and we had another wind event about a month and a half ago, and I said, how did those do? He said, they're all gone. So looking like an old growth forest, it doesn't mean it's intelligent if you think utilization of that forest product is a social or economic or cultural value. You have to have, frankly, a forester's or someone with experience in managing woods and know where soils may likely not be able to support if they're a higher prominence on a higher plateau or ridge, to make those decisions, not some theorist that wants to imitate an old forest in a pioneer zone to be making those decisions. So I won't, as you know, I could go on till after town meeting.
Jed, I think that just reiterates the need to be intentional about where we do things.
Ellen, can I just ask, and thank you for coming in and spending some time with us. How much of the land that you work with, that you help manage, is conserved, forest land?
I'd have to do my own inventory.
Is it like a small, without, yeah.
I would say it's prevalent. And I think that landowner interest is also, has a broad range. You would find people very excited about these opportunities. You would find people who are middle of the road, and you would find people who are adamantly opposed.
I just asked, what percent do you think in current use? Pretty high.
What percent, I'm gonna reiterate the question,
Right,
excuse me. What percentage of
The forest you're working in.
99%
Oh, wow.
of my clients that I work with 250 clients, 249 are enrolled in current use.
You've been doing this for a while. Not trying to pin down your age, but
15-ish years.
in the course of that time, how many of the landowners you work with have left the program? Have any?
I have a quick memory of one. And a voluntary withdrawal. None have left for becoming ineligible or violating their obligations.
Good. Well, thank you. And you're welcome to stay if you would
I
like.
will watch Sam a little bit.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
So then if we still have you, Sam. There, good. We'll turn, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
And we'll turn the floor right over to you.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. For the record, Sam Lincoln. I'm here today representing myself as a private landowner, fireman, forest landowner, and rural business owner, not any organization. I know I've introduced myself to the committee before, but I have a few background remarks to talk to you about my my history and experience in land use and planning and things like that. I own and operate a master logger certified mechanized timber harvesting business in Randolph Center. I am part of a multi-generational family that owns farm and forest land. We've been dairy and cash crop farmers, loggers, maple producers. My wife's family also operated a sawmill. At their peak, my agricultural enterprises did business with over 80 dairy, beef, and equine farmers a year. I've worked on timber harvesting projects over the past 25 years for more than 50 individual landowners, and many of them repeat clients, including 3 sitting legislators at the time, or past legislators. It generated millions of dollars in revenue for landowners in my business. I conservatively estimate that I've spent 16,000 hours working in Vermont's forests. That's just work days, not including meetings with landowners, attending trainings, going over, the closeout of the jobs, any of those kind of things. And so I've spent many years doing that. I served 6 years on Randolph's Development Review Board, and I also spent a year and a half on our Planning Commission. I was driven to to that volunteer work by concern about how land was being used as a rural working lands business owner, about how we developed our land, how we made plans around that. And I also served as a private sector representative on the Forest Fragmentation Study Committee for Act 171 in 2016, and examining forest fragmentation and ways to mitigate that. I support land conservation in many different forms, and I support the goals of Vermont Conservation Design. I recognize that H126 is a plan to achieve that and not a mandate. I have concerns with how the plan is to be developed and some of the specific language in the bill. I asked the committee to, as you get that run through that you talked about on Vermont Conservation Design maps and where the priority areas are, it's really important to recognize that the millions of acres on the landscape that are under private land ownership and have remained undeveloped in a wide range of shapes and sizes, they're ripe for conservation because people have made, there's cultural history, generations, if not centuries, of people making a living on the land. Families like my own that valued land as undeveloped and managed to produce working lands commodities, agricultural and forest products. And it would be the worst case scenario to subdivide my land, my family's land, and use it for something other than open land. And I feel like the landowners have really been left out of this process. That there is language in the bill that alludes to or directs this planning process to hear from landowners in a few public comment periods and things like that. But that really doesn't, when you look at this at a high level, a land use change, a goal of having 30% and then 50% of the land in a permanent conservation easement within 7 or the 27 years, without starting with what landowners' needs are as the beginning, is really a problem. I have a serious problem with that we're not meeting landowners where they are. Forest landowners that I have worked with have very consistent characteristics. They're almost all enrolled in the use value appraisal program. They have many goals for the management of their land other than generating revenue from timber sales, but the revenue is consistently important to them. Landowners have holding costs, needs, property taxes, the family needs for money. Buying and paying a mortgage on a piece of land and paying taxes on it for many families is an enormous part of their life in Vermont, what they accomplish. And they have those goals. They make a lot of decisions about their land use based on practical information and best practices that they've learned from interactions with a licensed consulting forester, the county forester. They may have been to a Vermont Woodlands Walk in the Woods or a Vermont Coverts retreat. They care about ecosystem protection. I have landowners that stop me in the woods and say, what can we do? We're walking, with the forester and the landowner, and they talk about environmental protection and they talk about wildlife habitat, and they want to know what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And they put those forward as their goals. And to have, but on top of that, they need flexibility within best practices and continuously improving practices to implement those things and to meet their needs. I have never had, and all those many landowners that I've worked with, I have never had one of them come to me and say, the best thing I can do is have this highly restrictive conservation agreement on my land because I don't want to do anything with it. I don't want to recreate. I don't want income. I don't want to cut my own firewood. I don't hear that from landowners. And I think that again, while I support the goal of making sure our land is conserved, maybe by a different definition than this bill includes, it's not what I hear landowners saying that they want. And so that's a first part of it is I think landowners need to be heard from in this and their goals. It doesn't meet them where they are. I think there isn't there isn't mention in this bill of the root causes of forest fragmentation or conversion to non-forest uses, and I believe those are very much rooted in the economics of land ownership, and just buying people's rights from them to not develop their land does not solve. It's like a one-time solution to those problems, and I believe strongly that we need solutions to slow or stop forest fragmentation that work for families when they're sitting at their kitchen table having discussions about their finances, about their goals. Because if forest fragmentation and the loss of biodiversity is addressed purely with a regulatory effort, which this isn't a regulatory effort, but that to me will not be successful. It doesn't have the buy-in of where the types of things landowners need to do. There are ways that rural landowners use their land and subdivide their land that are not going to be eligible for this, that are really important. We have farmers and forest landowners that sometimes will subdivide off house lots so they can buy more land and put it under their ownership. And as I said, I feel like my land is conserved and protected because of my family's history of ownership and land protection, because we could make a living. The other part of this is that we're talking about the possibility of the bill says prioritizing 10% conservation in these most restrictive categories, and I don't think the bill does not ask the report back from the secretary to analyze. Representative Templeton asked earlier about the impact of that, and I think that the impact of this level of conservation and restrictive use of the land has not been analyzed. You know, when we talk, I know you've heard from dairy committees and things like that. I'm a past dairy farmer and very involved with the dairy industry. The highs and lows of the dairy industry were caused by 3% swings in production supply and things like that. We're talking about taking possibly 10% of the land out of production in the state of Vermont, and maybe more. And what is the impact of that on the supply chain? Because it's not just this land that this bill calls for as a priority, but there are other efforts underway to stop forest management. The bill also talks about public land management. There's the federal land. There's a push to stop forest management on federal land. There are groups buying land and putting it into wilderness. And I think the totality of what's going on needs to be discussed, because we have a supply chain of essential goods that humans are consuming every day. And a net decrease in the harvesting of trees in Vermont will not result in a net decrease to feed the supply chain. It only externalizes that environmental impact, if you will. Doing it well, doing it here, the possibilities that Alan talked about in his earlier testimony. We're here. We want to solve the problems. We want to develop plastic replacements out of wood fiber. So those are the types of issues and the things I don't think it is, a robust rural economy is talked about in the bill, but there are some big challenges that we really need to zoom out and take a look at. And because I just, again, as a landowner who wants to support this, I don't see these categories, these definitions of conservation working, having buy-in. So I have, and one other thing I'd like to just talk about really quickly in this is that in some of the discussions around this, it's always been about logging or not logging. And it's about forest management. Logging is a tool, an instrument of licensed foresters that are educated and professionals. And the idea that it's logging or not logging, it should not be viewed as clear cutting versus untouched forest. And I think that our forest management projects, the work that we do, completes a whole host of projects and needs of landowners when we're on their property with our machines. And we're always looking for opportunities to improve and implement best practices. And so I just think the discussion should be framed a little bit more around the totality of what people do with their land and their needs, more so than just logging or wilderness. So I do have, I'm not ready to present them today. I do have some concepts that I'd like to present to you after town meeting break that need a little bit more work. And but I'd like to stop there for any questions.
Great, thank you, Sam. Questions? Representative Rice?
Thanks. So I just note that in the bill, the first step of the plan is, under the plan shall include is a review of the 3 conservation categories defined and suggestions for modifications or additions to these categories. So I'd be interested to hear sort of why that doesn't meet your standards for what this is, which is a plan, not a mandate or a regulation. And the fact that the first step is make sure we've got these categories right, and if not, suggest ways to modify them, why that doesn't meet it doesn't live up to your concerns here.
I think because of the unaddressed impact on the rural economy, because there are very specific categories of conservation, but the impact of them and the input of the definitions of those has not been as sort of starting out. Those of us that work and own land and work the land, that's sort of putting a train down the tracks ahead of us having input on it. Because the plan starts to build an inventory around those definitions that got moving before we had a chance, if you will, because this is, unless it's amended, unless those definitions or the report back is amended, then we're starting with that, which essentially excludes a lot of the activities that rural landowners do with their land as the starting point.
Representative O'Brien?
Sam, I'm just trying to think of, do you consider current use, like all those forests are potentially working lands, right? Because forests are managing them with landowners. County forests are checking off on these. It's over half of Vermont forests are in current use. So could the goals for this bill potentially be achieved by a tweak or two to the current use program, as far as foresters and landowners maybe identifying sections of their forest, sort of what we did last year, where this is a good spot for an old forest here. Let's work with, manage with the forest economy on the rest of our forest.
I think so. I mean, there are some very specific definitions in current use value appraisal program that call out special areas in forests that are privately owned and enrolled eligibility in that program that may be a very good place to address this. As you said, half the eligible land in the state is enrolled in that, and I think that is an excellent place to take a look at this and say how and where in use value appraisal could that work? I think so.
So you mentioned it, Sam, and I think it had come up earlier that I see you, Lipsky, I'll get you in a minute. That there's no mandate in the bill. It's a play on, and there are goals clearly laid out, which, by the way, I don't know if it says so here, but I understand that these are worldwide goals, the United Nations goals. I'm pretty sure we've heard that. Maybe we want to know a little bit more about whether, in fact, they're talking about the same thing. But given that there's no requirement of any landowner to participate, it sounds like the concern, and I'm just trying to get to what I think is the real core of the issue here, and you can tell me if I'm not there, but the real concern is that landowners will be incentivized, somehow will be, I don't want to use the word coerced because there is no obligation here on any landowner, but that that conservation funding would be available, and that landowners would say, okay, I will participate in this, I will conserve my land, and that land won't be available going forward in the same way that it's available today for as working lands. Is that, am I getting at the core of the issue?
Well, I think, again, talking about it under the premise that it has been discussed in this committee and the other, in the environment and energy, that it is voluntary. And if I think that there is a concern that, you know, if I'm a farmer that rents land from my neighbors and they enroll their land in the farmland that I lease in a conservation program that is highly restrictive, that reduces my ability to grow my farm, sustain my farm, my agricultural enterprise. The same in the forest economy supply chain. If landowners voluntarily choose to do this, they take it out of active production, then there's a concern about the critical mass there. I think, and that gets to maybe some of my, like the big picture concern. I don't necessarily think, you know, coercion certainly isn't the right word, or mandate or force, but if the goal is there and the concerns of the working lands are alleviated by saying, well, it's voluntary, then that goes to, well, how do the proponents of the bill expect to achieve it if it's voluntary? It needs to be attractive. It's going to be voluntary. It needs to be attractive. And that's what I'm saying, that it doesn't, that these categories, these definitions of conservation, I don't hear landowners. My experience is, you know, Orange County, Vermont, not the entire state, but I certainly have worked with landowners in my role at the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, work with people all over the state of Vermont, all over the region. I work with forest landowners and logging contractors. I don't hear people saying, you know what I need to do? Tie my land up in a highly restrictive conservation agreement that I've paid a mortgage on it, I pay taxes on it, but I cannot, it's unknown. Even just the category of outdoor recreation in these definitions, what's going to happen to mountain biking, snowmobiling? If you're like, what happens to those things in those definitions? That's unknown to me. I'm not saying that they're not allowed or are allowed. I don't know. So to get back to your direct question, I think that if it's voluntary, if our concerns are going to be dissuaded or addressed by saying it's voluntary and we don't expect too many people to do this, then what's the point? Like, let's make it attractive. Let's find ways to do that. The other flip side of that too is, I'd say to the committee, what happens to the other 70% of the land in Vermont? If we're going to concentrate more activity there, more conversion to housing, more forest management activities, other things like that, like, how does that happen? Where there's a simultaneous effort going on right now too of the Forest Futures Roadmap. And how does that play in? How, as I said to the Environment and Energy Committee, it talks about sustainable forest management. That requires people, it requires capital investment, it requires markets that pay revenue for these products. Vermont Conservation Design also calls for a significant amount of Vermont to be in, I'm sorry, I lost my place, in a significant amount into be young forest. And that's going to require a significant amount of harvesting. And we have to have a forest economy supply chain that's viable to achieve all these things. And we feel like there's an opportunity to have a bigger discussion here.
Representative Lipsky.
Oh, thank you, Chairman Durfee, and thank you, Sam, for being here to join this discussion. Your input's very important. I just have to comment, Chairman Durfee, where you spoke to this bill being sparked by United Nations declarations regarding the crisis. And it's, to me, having been in forests in Mindanao, in a major harvest area, you know, one concession was the size of 2/3 of Vermont. It's in the southern Philippines, Iona, Mindanao, Bisley Bay. I've been in South America in forest operations, in budding and digging into the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, near Barretos, where there were conversion going on for raising citrus, this sort of stuff, and in the Congo. But the point is, what the United Nations is concerned about is 179.99 degrees away from what we're dealing with in the state of Vermont, what Vermont landowners and forests are dealing with. It is not, I don't believe it's the same, it's even a relevant crisis. If you want to restrict or make a plan for Vermont, don't base it on the crisis that is happening in other parts of the globe. So that's just one point that seemed remarkable to me. Being in there face to face. You know, I have had a concern that 126 did fail. In my limited perspective to reach out to the landowner community, to the forester community, to the timber harvester community and the industry in general. And whether it was by accident or oversight, I don't know, but I am someone who's worked in this business for 56 years. When you seem to be ignored, or your needs or interests or place at the table or in the discussion are ignored, you don't necessarily feel, well, that's great, I don't matter. You really feel that vulnerable, because I think when you work in this field and your goals and experience are not considered as part of the discussion, it's somewhat, it makes me feel disingenuous. But with that said, you know, I want to point out that when they talk about replicating old growth forests or wilderness areas, which there are some, probably need to be more, but the categories that they call ecological reserve areas or biodiversity conservation areas, as either under leadership of foresters, but as a logger statutorily, there isn't a cutting plan I've done in the last 10 years where fragile areas were eliminated from the hardest area. They may have been 25% of the area where it could have been vernal pools or wetlands or other sensitive habitat, certainly streams, intermittent as well as perennial streams, particularly steep sloped ones. The buffer zone and the riparian zone expands exponentially when slope factors and soil stability is a risk. So there's a lot of every job pretty much I've worked on that falls into those categories, yet the property in a whole is managed. I tried to explain to a counselor the other day that it's not still part of a forest ecology or forest landscape if it is a stream or if it is a wetland. But so now those areas are off limits just in pure practice, best management practice, AMPs. So that, and there are many areas of state forests, some maybe in national forests, where there are fragile zones, certainly at certain elevations that are already put a lot of forest cover into those categories. So the 30 by 30 as a goal, we're very close to that already as far as I'm concerned. And that's not as much of a threat. It's more of the lack of engagement and collaboration with the industry, if you want to call some industry, the forest landowners, stakeholders, and those that work in the woods, foresters and loggers.
So, go ahead, Representative O'Brien.
just while we had Alan and Sam here, you guys have been at this decades, and I just wondered, if Vermont Forest, 4.5 million acres, 2.5 is in current use, and the state and federal government owns another 500,000, right? So we're around 2 million are not in those programs. What's happening with those forests? What you guys have seen and just anecdotally, how do they compare to the current use of managed forests and the managed ones in the state and the national Green Mountain Forest?
Maybe I'll give Sam an opportunity. He's still on, but Will and I'll take a stab.
Alan, if you don't mind, if you want to start, and I'd be happy to fill in after.
Why don't you come back to the table there, Alan? Thank you.
Question is, what's happening on the other non-public lands, non-conserved
We don't care
lands?
about them very much.
If I were to characterize them as being different, or how they are different, I would say primarily they're held by landowners like myself and like Sam, who consider and take very strongly the responsibility that we're stewards of the land and we want to take care of the long list of goals. How they're different is not that much. I mean, the regulations and the interests are all pretty much the same. There may be differences on a small scale, but on average, Vermont's forests are very homogeneous in condition. They are roughly very young, 75 to 100 years old. That's the consequence of our past land use. The species distribution is very similar. I could close my eyes and guess what your property in Shaftesbury, what you're looking out your door in Shaftesbury looks like. Excuse me. Thank you. Tunbridge, even closer. Forgive me. I'm sorry about that. I lived in Shaftesbury, so that's easier for me. So I wouldn't characterize them as much different.
So I guess you can represent too, but the management that's been going on in current use hasn't really changed what they look like over 30, 40 years now.
The management has an impact on what forests look like. They're intended to achieve certain goals and improve productivity and forest health. But the forest health data shows that trajectory, as I alluded to earlier, trajectory of Vermont's forests. I don't think that trajectory of maturing forests is any different on a privately held current use parcel than it is on public lands. That they look very similar.
Sam, I think.
My experience has been, as I mentioned at the beginning, almost every landowner that I am contracted, brought on site to do work for is in current use. If a landowner is not in current use, the very first thing I suggest to them for a forest management project is to bring a licensed forester in and to make those decisions. I say, I may do a walk of the property with them and I'll take say, here's your goals. You need to bring a licensed forester in to make those decisions for you. But in terms of, I rarely work with anything other than long-term forest management. As I said in the Environment and Energy Committee, in my 25 years working in the forest, I've only had 2 landowners that I worked for that cleared house lots for development. That's extremely non-typical of the work that I do. I do occasionally have dairy farmers that contract with me to clear land and almost always it's expansion of an organic dairy farm that needs more pasture land or crop land close to their barn. And I think, when we're talking about forest use, I'm not sure if I'm getting, how people are using their land, and that's often still done within the guidelines of the use value appraisal program. But I don't have a lot of experience with landowners that are not in the use value appraisal program. And, I think from both my role as a private business owner and my role at the department, I think it's a gold standard program that I have, as a logging contractor, I've watched in one generation, foresters that were managing land when I was in grade school. I'm now working on those parcels, and I see the value they created, the health resilience of those forests through care and continuous improvement. And it's so impressive in just 30 years to see what a caring, a logger that was doing terrific work 30 years ago, that it's basically invisible that somebody was there other than some stumps. And there's high quality, healthy trees growing there of diverse ages and classes, all those, it's important to the core of who I am to perpetuate that for another generation, that somebody can come to the sites that we work 30 years from now and say, look at the good job they did. Look at there's the quality of work they did. So this has been going on a long time, and like parcel after parcel after parcel, whether it was in use value appraisal or not, the forest management and the quality of the work done by logging contractors has improved in so much generationally.
Representative Cole, did you have hand up earlier? Sam, thank you. Alan, thank you again. I think most of the rest of the legislature has left Montpelier. I want to just make sure that we're all not, I appreciate the committee staying, and
Sam has one more.
Good to hear from both of you. Yeah, final thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Chair Durfee. If I may, I would like to come back after town meeting day break, when you all had a chance to come up for air and discuss some specific concepts for the bill for your consideration that I think, again, align with the goals of the bill and the goals of many members to reach conservation goals and find some balance in all this.
Well, both of you, I think, earlier in a question, I think maybe Alan also offered to be specific and with solutions or suggestions. So what I was going to ask is if you would both turn in any written comments that you have. We'll then have a chance to read those over, and they should be posted and made available to the public. If you have specific proposals that you'd like to share with us and want to work together, that might not be a bad approach. We'll be happy to consider whatever you want to share, but it might make sense if we're not looking at more than one or two completely different suggestions anyway. So we do have another witness who had been scheduled earlier, couldn't be here after lunch, so we'll be hearing from Ed Larson. We've reached out to a couple of other folks. So I imagine we will have some time when we're back, not next week, but the following week. So there's some time anyway between now and then to put something together.
Brief. Both Sam Lincoln and Alan Thompson have dual roles. They are forest workers and they are forest landowners. Mm-hmm. If either of you knew someone who didn't wear 2 or 3 hats, who was simply a landowner and had some familiarity with Bill 126, and they may be able to add insight that you can't because of your complex, broad ranges of involvement, might add something different. If you could suggest to Chairman Durfee or this committee, someone who might be able to add something from strictly a woodland owner's perspective. Brief enough, Chairman.
Yeah, that was good. So yeah, thank you again, and feel free to be in touch. Just before we adjourn for the day and for the week, we still need to get from Representative Templeman the language.
I'll be the last one here.
Thank you.
Well, we're not, because appropriations just came in saying, "Where's your memo?" So we need to wrap that up so they can be done. But I don't think the committee needs to stay. and you're welcome to, but I think we're just waiting on Dave to supply a paragraph or a couple of sentences really to drop into the
It'll go in the memo.
memo, yeah, and then we will hit send and that will be
Do you
done.
need me to finish that before we leave?
Not before the group leaves, but we,
Okay. Yes, I'm,
yeah.